Oh, Grant Roberts.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Silent colleague to my left there, but I'm sure. Thank you. I'm sure Jacinda Ardern will take a call shortly. Mr. Chair, I want to pick up Jamie Lee Ross's observation about the purpose of Part 2 to be about the tax obligations of offshore people and those people paying their fair share, which is a noble goal and one that the committee had in its mind as we worked our way through the government's policy to introduce a resident land withholding tax for offshore persons. If only such noble goals were part of the government's overall tax policy, where offshore people paid their fair share, for instance through trusts, then we would actually have a tax system that New Zealanders could look at and as my colleague Jamie Lee Ross has just said, where everybody pays their fair share. But there was a complete failure by the government to have that kind of consistency, as we've seen in the last few days. And it all gets murkier, Mr. Chair. We now see that the Prime Minister's got deposits in companies that specialise in offshore trusts, and it gets murkier by the moment, Mr. Bennett. That's what happens when you don't front up, go to New Zealanders with information about your tax affairs. Mr. Bennett might not care about that, but other New Zealanders do. They want to see fairness in the tax system, just as Jamie Lee Ross said he thought this part of the bill was aimed at. Mr. Chair, it was disturbing in the committee as we worked through the resident land withholding tax issue that we were correcting mistakes made in legislation passed only a matter of months earlier. And we did that twice, once covering Part 2 and once covering, which we'll cover in Part 4. And essentially that came down to the fact that the various new definitions that the government had come up with to put in both the Income Tax Act and the Tax Administration Act didn't fit when it came to a resident land withholding tax issue. And so in this part of the bill, we're looking at the definition around offshore person. And as I do support what Jamie Lee Ross said, which is that the committee did come to the conclusion that the definition was far too broad when it came to being able to implement a resident land withholding tax in a meaningful and sensible way. And the officials from IRD came to the committee and said, if we keep the same definition for offshore person as we've passed in the previous piece of legislation, we are going to find that almost impossible to implement. They gave us an example of a trust or a partnership with a partner with a 1% share could make the entire partnership into an offshore person. And that would then put in place a set of obligations that would have been difficult both for that entity and for the IRD to follow up. So we on this side of the House accepted that change and agreed to it on the grounds that what we're trying to do is create a basis by which those who do invest in New Zealand from offshore have an understanding of what their requirements are. That should not be read, Mr. Chair, as members on this side of the House believing that we don't think those who are offshore persons have obligations, because we do. They should have obligations that make them part of a globally transparent system. And while in this particular aspect of the definition of offshore person we can see sense, the Minister and the Chair might want to take a call to talk here about the consistency now of the obligations of offshore people across the Income Tax Act. Because what we are setting up, I believe, Mr. Chair, as a result of the changes that we're making here, is a system where we're putting certain obligations on offshore persons with regard to the resident land withholding tax, and then completely ignoring making those obligations tighter, for instance, around the obligations around foreign trusts. So the Minister might want to stand up and let us know whether he thinks we are being consistent. Yes, we are changing and amending the legislation to make it different from the two previous pieces of legislation that we passed, but is that consistent across all of the tax legislation that we have? Mr. Chair, the other point that I wanted to pick up here is whether or not we can actually use the term offshore person at all. And that was an amendment that we made again in the committee. So we now have in the Act an offshore person, and now under clause 45.8, an offshore RLWT person. So the government has got itself in the position where it is trying to so finely define within this section exactly who will be covered by the new resident land withholding tax that they had to create a new class of person within the Act. Mr Chair,
Grant Robertson.
I won't take a full second call on this, but I just want to make the point that this level of complexity around what the government thinks it's trying to achieve with the bright line test, to me highlights the fact that they didn't think all of these particular policies through together. This is the third bill in a series of 3. At each stage in the select committee process, the large accounting firms in New Zealand have come to the committee and said the government's policy position is confusing us, because we now have a series of changes, and I'm using clause 45.8 to highlight this, where we have different definitions, different meanings, and the accountancy profession, you know, who for various reasons are getting a bit of a hauling over the coals at the moment, are telling the select committee and telling New Zealanders that they don't believe that the government has consistent policy here, one that's easy to follow. And my fear, Mr Chair, is that this will not be the last time, possibly even this year, that we end up amending legislation we've only just passed. And that really comes down to poor work by the Minister, in my view, in not having a decent plan and a consistent plan for how we're going to be able to do this. So we now have an offshore resident land withholding tax person alongside an offshore person, and a definition of offshore person that we've changed as well. So we're making those 3 changes all in one go because the government basically couldn't get us act together. So, Mr Chair, I just wanted to make those points on part 2. I'm going to return to a later call shortly around the other change that we made around bank account requirements for offshore persons. This is largely dealt with under the Tax Administration Act provisions that fall under part 4, but it does bear mentioning that these clauses within part 2 also indicate where the government hasn't been able to get its act together and have a coherent policy.
Mr Chair.